On August 18, 1940, in the shadow of a world war that threatened to consume Western civilization, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King sat down at Ogdensburg, New York, and signed one of the most consequential bilateral agreements in North American history. What they created was called the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, the senior advisory body on continental military defense of North America, consisting of both Canadian and American military and civilian representatives, meeting semi-annually to provide policy-level consultation on bilateral defense matters. That institution, born from the darkest chapter of the 20th century, survived 86 years of geopolitical upheaval, until now. On Monday, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby wrote on social media that his department would halt its involvement in the Permanent Joint Board on Defense to reassess the forum's benefits. No prior U.S. administration has suspended participation in the PJBD, underscoring the unprecedented nature of Monday's announcement. Let that sink in. 15 presidents, 13 Canadian prime ministers, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 9/11, multiple Cold War flashpoints, and not once did Washington pull back from this foundational institution, until Donald Trump did it on a Monday morning via posts on X. The Pentagon accused Canada of failing to make credible progress on its defense commitments, with Elbridge Colby writing, "We can no longer avoid the gaps between rhetoric and reality." Washington framed this as a matter of military burden sharing. But that framing deserves serious scrutiny because the facts on the ground tell a very different story. Carney announced in March that Canada had hit its 2% defense spending target years ahead of schedule and was on track to hit 3.5% by 2035. He declared, "Over the next decade, Canada will unleash $500 billion in defense investment, from submarines and aircraft to drones, sensors, and radar systems. In a more dangerous and divided world, Canada is taking full responsibility for defending our sovereignty and building our strength as a reliable partner." So if Canada was already hitting NATO targets and planning $500 billion in defense investment, what was this really about? The suspension was explicitly tied to remarks Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland earlier this year. Remarks that largely ended the previously friendly relations between Trump and Carney. Carney went to Davos in January and told the world that middle powers negotiating bilaterally with a hegemon negotiate from weakness and risk the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. His message was coded, but Washington decoded it immediately. This was a direct intellectual rebuke of Trump's entire strategic posture. Carney also declared at Davos, "The middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy." Those words hit Washington like a grenade. Here was a G7 ally, America's largest trading partner at the time, standing at the world's most prestigious economic forum and essentially organizing a multilateral bloc to counterbalance American leverage. Trump did not forget. And apparently the Pentagon did not forget either. More recently, Carney posted a video address to Canadians in which he declared that the country's once close economic ties to the United States had become a liability. "Many of our former strengths based on our close ties to America have become weaknesses," Carney said. This was not diplomatic caution. This was a deliberate sovereign declaration that Canada was charting its own course, and Washington interpreted it as provocation. In January, Carney traveled to Beijing and declared a new strategic partnership with China, the first visit by a Canadian prime minister to China in 8 years. From Washington's perspective, this was the clearest possible signal. Canada was not just refusing to fall in line, it was actively pivoting toward America's primary geopolitical rival. The Pentagon's response to the PJBD was, in this light, not impulsive. It was calculated retaliation wrapped in the language of burden sharing. Under a plan announced by Carney in February, Canada will invest $500 billion, US $360 billion in its defense industry over the next 10 years. Carney acknowledged that Canada had not done enough to defend itself in an increasingly dangerous world and that counting on U.S. protection was no longer viable. "We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us," Carney said. That admission was significant, but it also confirmed exactly what Carney had been arguing for months. Canada could not afford to remain strategically dependent on a Washington that had become strategically unpredictable. Defense Minister David McGuinty stated Canada is always ready for constructive discussion on how to strengthen mutual security, according to Global News. The Prime Minister's office has emphasized that Canada hit the 2% NATO target in fiscal year 2025 to 26 and has committed to 5% of GDP under the Hague Pledge. That response was measured, dignified, deliberately low temperature. And therein lies the strategic genius or the strategic exposure, depending on which side of the border you're sitting on. Carney's government, which ran explicitly on a platform of defending Canadian sovereignty against what it characterized as economic coercion from Washington, is unlikely to offer a public retraction of the Davos remarks. And why would it? Carney was elected precisely because of those remarks. The Canadian public gave him a mandate to stand firm, and backing down now would be domestic political suicide. So Ottawa plays it cool, issues measured statements, and watches Washington make the noise. Artur Wilczynski, a former Canadian diplomat who attended the board's meetings while holding a senior post at Public Safety Canada, wrote on X, "The lack of joint coordination will affect the U.S. too. Bizarre decision by the Trump regime." That observation matters. The suspension of the PJBD is not a cost-free move for Washington. The board coordinates military planning across one of the most strategically critical borders on the planet. 5,525 miles of shared geography, shared airspace, shared Arctic approaches. Sean Maloney, a professor of history at Royal Military College who has written about the board, told CBC News that the Trump administration's move to pull out sends a strong signal because the board and its Military Cooperation Committee do a lot of useful work on defense planning. The U.S. withdrawal basically generates more friction in the system than we need right now. That friction has costs, real operational costs, coordination delays, communication gaps at exactly the moment when North American Arctic defense is becoming more, not less, strategically urgent. The most important thing to understand about the pause is what it does not change. NORAD, the binational North American Aerospace Defense Command, headquartered in Colorado Springs, is governed by a separate treaty and is unaffected by this decision. Canadian Armed Forces personnel posted to NORAD continue their duties. So Washington's move is real, but it is bounded. It is a diplomatic instrument, not an operational severance. The Pentagon knows it cannot afford to blow up NORAD, so it blows up the PJBD instead, using the older advisory body as a pressure lever while keeping the critical operational architecture intact. In February, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, warned that if Ottawa does not buy the F-35's North American Aerospace Defense Command, a defense partnership operated jointly by the two countries would have to be altered. As of late April, Canada was still reviewing its planned purchase of 88 Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jets. This is the hidden commercial dimension beneath the diplomatic theater. Washington is using defense architecture as leverage in an arms procurement dispute worth tens of billions of dollars. The PJBD suspension may be, at its core, a pressure tactic to force Canada back into the F-35 purchase. John McKay, the former MP who served as the Canadian co-chair the last time the board met, said the decision casts doubt over such things as the renegotiation of the NORAD Joint Command Agreement and military cooperation more broadly. And this is where Carney's broader strategic architecture becomes relevant. If Washington uses military architecture as tariff leverage and procurement leverage simultaneously, Ottawa must find alternative frameworks. Carney's Beijing visit, his Davos speech, his cultivation of European partners, all of this starts to look less like impulsiveness and more like a deliberate hedge against American coercion. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Fox News said that Trump spoke to Carney and that Carney was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made at Davos. Bessent added, "I'm not sure what the Prime Minister was thinking. Of course, Canada depends on the U.S., but that framing, that Canada simply depends on the U.S. and must fall in line, is precisely the logic Carney has been dismantling, brick by brick, since taking office. The era of automatic Canadian deference to Washington is structurally over, and Washington's own behavior, tariffs, annexation rhetoric, PJBD suspension, is accelerating that structural shift faster than any Canadian politician could have managed alone. Erin O'Toole, the former leader of Canada's Conservative Party, criticized Colby's move in a post on X. This is profoundly misguided and quite strange coming right after the president's visit to China. Canada has been and will be an ally that shares values of liberty. As a Canadian whose grandfather deployed to Alaska for joint defense in WEBI II, I hope we don't lose sight of that. The fact that a conservative Canadian politician, not a Carney ally, is condemning the U.S. move tells you something important. This is not a partisan Canadian reaction. It is a national one. Washington has already moved the standard to 3.5% of GDP, meaning Canada would need to more than double its current defense budget to satisfy the new American benchmark. That scale of demand, imposed in the same breath as punishing tariffs, annexation threats, F-35 coercion, and now PJBD suspension, reveals a pattern. Washington is not calibrating its pressure. It is escalating it relentlessly, banking on the assumption that Canada will eventually break. But what if Canada doesn't break? What if instead it builds? The defense pressure lands against a backdrop that Washington has watched with mounting unease. In January, Carney traveled to Beijing and declared a new strategic partnership with China, the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister to China in 8 years. That visit was a strategic signal, not of alignment with Beijing, but of optionality. Canada is telling Washington, we have other doors we can open. That message is landing in a Pentagon that already views China as the defining threat of this century. Carney is threading a very narrow needle, asserting sovereignty without triggering an actual rupture, and so far, the needle holds. Although the PJBD is supposed to meet at least annually, the last readout published by Canada or the US of a meeting was back in November 2024 in Ottawa, suggesting the body has not met since Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, which means the board had already been functionally dormant for months before Monday's announcement. Washington is formalizing an abandonment that had already happened in practice. The announcement is less a decision than a declaration, a public statement of diplomatic intent. The Trump administration is in alignment across every trade and economic agency, and the elimination of the USMCA with Canada is clearly at the end of this path, according to analysis from the Conservative Treehouse. If that analysis is correct, the PJBD suspension is not the destination. It is a waypoint. The destination is a full restructuring of the North American economic and security relationship, with Canada forced into bilateral negotiations from a position of maximum isolation. That is the Trump playbook applied to an ally, and it is without historical precedent. The world is watching. The announcement reflects a weakening of U.S. relationships with traditional Western allies during Trump's second term. Every NATO partner, every Five Eyes member, every ally that has sheltered under American security guarantees for 80 years is now running the same calculation. If Washington will suspend an 86-year military pact with its closest neighbor over a speech at Davos, what does American alliance membership actually guarantee? That question, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, is the real exposure, not Canada's, Washington's. Because Carney's response has not been panic. It has been preparation. $500 billion in defense investment, NATO targets met, diplomatic diversification, a measured tone that refuses to give Washington the outrage it is looking for. And that steadiness in the face of maximum pressure may prove to be the most strategically effective response of all. The 1940 Pact survived a world war. Whether the relationship it represented can survive Trump's second term is the defining question of North American geopolitics in our time.